second text today comes from the Gospel of John, chapter 13, verses 1 through 5 and 12 through 17. Listen again for the word of the Lord. Now, before the festival of the Passover, Jesus knew that his hour had come to depart from this world and go to the Father. Having loved his own who were in the world, he loved them to the end. The devil had already put it into the heart of Judas, son of Simon Iscariot, to betray him. And during supper, Jesus, knowing that the Father had given all things into his hand, and that he had come from God and was going to God, got up from the table, took off his outer robe, and tied a towel around himself. Then he poured water into a basin and began to wash the disciples' feet and to wipe them with the towel that was tied around him. After he had washed their feet, had put on his robe, and had returned to the table, he said to him, "Do you know what I have done to you? You call me teacher and Lord, and you are right, for that's what I am. So if I, your Lord and teacher, have washed your feet, you also ought to wash one another's feet. For I have set an example that you should do as I have done to you. Very truly I tell you, servants are not greater than their master, nor are messengers greater than the one who sent them. If you know these things, you are blessed if you do them." Friends, this is the word of the Lord. Thanks be to God. In 1968, Francois Clemens, a gay black man from Birmingham, Alabama, found himself singing in a church choir in Pittsburgh, Pennsylvania. Francois had a huge personality and a huge voice to match it, so perhaps it is unsurprising that he caught the ear one Sunday of a young Presbyterian pastor with a nationally syndicated television show. Fred Rogers asked Francois immediately to join his televised neighborhood as make-believe's friendly police officer. It is significant enough that Clemens was the first African-American regular character on a television show in the United States. That is significant enough. Add to that the setting. 1968. Only months before Clemens became make-believe's police chief, Dr. King had been assassinated. And not long before that, while marching from Selma to Montgomery, white and black protesters had been beaten, gassed, and abused by Alabama troopers. Bombs erupted in the streets of Clemens's hometown. Black Americans felt little support from white clergy or white law enforcement. Clemens was haunted by the images coming out of his state, and he felt a strong measure of resistance when the sweater-clad, upper-class Pennsylvanian came knocking. But Fred Rogers, fueled by his faith and a sense of common decency, had a vision. Francois Clemens would bring compassion and order and a new face to neighborhoods across the United States. Throughout the Gospel of John, Jesus performs signs, what we would commonly call miracles. And those signs point to some greater truth about his person and his work. The author of John, beginning all the way back in chapter 2, the wedding at Cana, reminds us that time and again, despite those signs, those powerful contradictions of supposed possibility, despite that, his hour had not yet come. We hear it over and over again in the gospel. His hour had not yet come. Not yet, the author of the text says. You may think that this is it. You may think that this is the big moment, feeding the 5,000 or walking on water. You may think that, but something bigger is brewing here. We hear it and hear it and hear it, and we get used to hearing it until in chapter 13, while surrounded by his friends, we get to the climax. Jesus knew that his hour had come. Jesus knew. Twice in chapter 13, the author of John assures us of Jesus' profound awareness. Surrounded by those whom he loves, he knows that he will be betrayed. He knows who he is from God and going to God. He knows that he is on the edge of life. And he knows that all the power and all the authority of heaven and earth is in his hands. The hour has arrived, and Jesus knows it. Everything in John's gospel has been pointing to this moment. The one who works wonders, the teacher, the Lord, this God will enact his greatest sign, and what will that sign be? Imagine, just for a minute, that you don't know what happens next. Imagine that all you know is a God in human likeness, in human form, is now confronted with the possibility and the reality of torture, of death, of crucifixion. Imagine that. In the movie, this is where the protagonist, backed into a corner, surveys the entire room. The room goes black, and then all of a sudden he deposes all of his enemies. The hero fights, and he wins. That's what's supposed to happen. That's the narrative expectation in moments like this. The hour has come for our hero. What will he do? Well, a man's got to eat, of course. And on the night he was betrayed, then, Jesus shares a meal with his friends, a good meal, lamb and wine, and the kind of comfort that can only come from being with those whom you love, the God of creation at table. It's startling enough, really, just that. That by itself is startling enough if you're paying attention. But the meal is not all. And at this moment, all of our expectations should turn on their side, knowing that his hour has come, knowing that he will die. The infinite God, finite in frail flesh, rises from the low-set table, takes off his outer robe, puts a towel around his waist, kneels, and begins to wash the feet of his disciples. Now, of course, certainly a foot washing. It was a common enough thing in those days. Travel had, let's call them, sanitary challenges in dusty Palestine. But washing another man's feet is, not for then and not for now. Washing another man's feet was the job for a servant, not a teacher. A job for a slave, not a lord. On his final night, Jesus Christ took up the towel of a servant in order to do the work of a servant, discarding his robes of privilege. He poured water over Peter's feet. He poured water over John's feet. He poured water over Judas's feet, and he rubbed them until the vat below turned black with the grime of life outside of that room. It is painfully intimate. It's almost embarrassing, really. The Lord, our servant, the God of creation, concerning himself with the cleanliness of our feet. It doesn't make a lick of sense. There were always rituals on the Sunday mornings that I had to spend with my grandparents at the Due West ARP church. Sunday school lasted, in my memory, 3 to 5 hours. And then there was a thorough reflection on the Word. There was a good dose of the Psalter, sung and resung and sung again. And then, just when you thought you were free, there were 45 minutes on the front steps of the church greeting every single person in the town and explaining to them whose I was and where I came from and why I was there. It took, in my memory, 24 to 48 hours altogether. And then after that, somehow it was only still 2 o'clock on Sunday. And that was time for supper. Y'all remember supper, that big Southern feast that only happens on Sundays that we all kept our church clothes on for. After supper, as the evening began to settle in, that's when I got my moment. That's when I got to go out to the farm. While my parents packed up our stuff, I went out with my grandfather to survey the land. I think probably we were there to do something. I'm guessing feed cows, but no one told me, or maybe I just didn't listen. And every time he would park his truck, and I would jump out of that truck with utter disregard for anything but my freedom. And if there was something to step in, y'all, if there was something to step in, I stepped in it, and trust me, there were so many things to step in, about as many as the number of cows, maybe 2 or 3 times more. And I would fall and tumble in the dust and the dirt, and by the end of the hour or so sojourn, I was just profoundly filthy. And I loved it. It happened every time. The car was packed and ready for departure until I came rolling out of the back of the pickup truck like Pigpen at the Christmas play. What is a mother supposed to do in this situation? I couldn't go in the house. It had just gotten cleaned up from Sunday supper, and I couldn't get in the car. I was covered in grime, and I needed a wash. Well, backwards as it may be, even in Due West, they had the technology known as a hose. So I positioned myself on a tarp in the middle of the yard while my mother, from a very safe distance, just sort of sprayed me in the highest setting. But that never did entirely work. There was just too much grit, right? There's too much of it. It's too deeply in you after an afternoon like that. And eventually, somebody had to go get the towel. Right there in the middle of the front lawn on a plastic tarp. Now, don't get me wrong. Don't think my mother's a total hero. That was an act of self-preservation. Self-preservation. She and my father had to sit in a car with me for 2 hours on the ride home, and one can only take so much, right? But in their Sunday clothes, ready to be anywhere except for there. It was also an act of service. She did for me what I was unwilling to do for myself. We have been asking ourselves along these weeks in this sermon series who Jesus is. An exorcist, our Lord, the vine, the teacher, the way, the truth, the life. Today we are confronted with this extra biblical concept, but one that seems deeply true. Today we are confronted with the paradox. To meet God is to meet a man on the edge of death. A man who, rather than seeking vengeance from the powers that pursue him or exercising sheer power over them, chooses to spend his final hours at supper. A man who washes the feet of his friends, who serves them, who does for them what they cannot do for themselves. This man, this God, is the sacrificial lamb and the steady shepherd, the prince and the slave, the Savior, the King, the Creator, who from before all time loved this world into being, the man whose death secures our life, who lays aside his prerogatives of power to reconcile a broken world. This is who Jesus is, and that is the power of God. Who is Jesus Christ today? We crane our necks, I think, too often. We crane our necks looking for God in our world. We look up as if salvation can only come from the sky. Perhaps, though, salvation is at our feet. Francois Clemens did not want to play a police officer on a children's television show in 1968. But you can't say no to Mr. Rogers. In 1969, at the tail end of one of the most tumultuous eras in American life, on this nationally syndicated television show, Mr. Rogers, this buttoned-up white pastor, he sat in his front yard, and 1 million kids all around America, they sat with him. And when Officer Clemens strolled by, Mr. Rogers invited him to rest for a moment too, to share a lemonade, and to cool his feet in a little kiddie pool. The camera lingered on Mr. Rogers' feet next to Officer Clemens's, a white churchman and a black officer sharing a space of vulnerability, of intimacy. It was an act of resistance. It was a refusal to accept things as they were. It was a fight, you better believe it. A rupture in apathy, a vision of hope, a gospel proclaimed, a sermon preached, and a command fulfilled, and it was nothing less than sacramental. The icon Fred Rogers remembered Clemens after Rogers' death. Not only was showing my brown skin in the tub with his white skin as two friends, but as I was getting out of that tub, he was helping me dry my feet. He was helping me dry my feet. No power but the counterintuitive gospel of love could compel that. The service, the resistance, and the transformation is utterly divine. God in a cardigan, God in an officer's cap. This text, John 13, is usually read on Maundy Thursday, the day the church sets aside during Holy Week to remember the mandate which Christ offered his disciples on the eve of his death. If I, your Lord and teacher, have washed your feet, you also ought to wash one another's feet. For I have set an example that you should do as I have done to you. We read it once a year, but let me tell y'all, this is not a once-a-year kind of text. This is who Jesus Christ is yesterday and today and forever. This is Jesus' moment. This is Jesus' hour. This is how God chooses to fight with a world set against him. Jesus lives into radical service, radical love. He washes the disciples' feet and he dries them. But this isn't just about Jesus. That's why it's not just a once-a-year text. It's also about us. It's about who we are and who we are called to be. Love one another, Jesus commands, just as I have loved you. This is our fight too. It's not a saloon-swinging shoot 'em up. It's not a revenge fantasy. It's not a thunderbolt of power to solve all of the world's problems. It is an absolute refusal to accept things the way they are. It is a rejection of any kingdom that builds power by exploitation. It is a rejection of the notion that we can use others as tools of our own self-advancement. It is a rejection of all moral relativism. The radical power of God is the power of a people who see the chaos of the world, who see all of the other ways and follow a better way. It is the power of a people armed with a bucket of water and a dirty old towel. What does it mean to be a Christian in our world? Imagine all of the power in this room, y'all, all of the privilege we embody. I'm not talking about wealth. I'm not talking about your finance. I'm not talking about any of that stuff. I am simply talking about the power of our being in the world, the freedom that we have to move in this world, that power, that privilege. All of that is utterly meaningless if we do not strip ourselves of it, wield it, as it were, in acts of radical, inclusive, uncomfortable service by which we will make ourselves known as followers of Christ and his greater way. Salvation is at our feet, and we are being called to follow. In 2006, evolutionary biologist and outspoken atheist Richard Dawkins gave an interview on science and faith in Time magazine. This is what he says to close out the interview. I don't see the Olympian gods or Jesus coming down and dying on the cross as worthy of the grandeur of the supernatural. If there is a God, he says, it's going to be a whole lot bigger and a whole lot more incomprehensible than anything any theologian of religion has ever proposed. We crane our necks looking for God in our world. Perhaps what is so shocking in John 13 is just how approachable, just how comprehensible God is. The God who washes our feet is far more a challenge to our deeply ingrained systems, to our mindless apathy, to our benign neglect, than some abstract God far removed from us. God is a whole lot bigger than we can ever imagine, but God has chosen to make God's self known by washing our feet. That is the fight. That's the task. A fight against who the world has told us to be, against the competition and the stereotypes we are meant to uphold, a fight against the divisions that we are asked to protect, that we are told will save us. We crane our necks looking for God in our world, but God has chosen to reveal himself in vulnerability, in acts of service, as familiar as a paper cut, a pang of recognition, a towel to wash us down, a pool to cool our feet. It is a scandal to Dawkins and a challenge to us. Love them as I have loved you. That's the command. That's the mandate. That's the ethics. Those are the final words before they go on their way and he goes on to die. It is all we need. All we need to know. We have to do it too. Love lived in a bowl of water with which we wash one another's feet. Love in the neighborhood, shocking our ambivalence and proclaiming God's radical justice. Love in the front yard with tender care. Love in places we have not yet begun to imagine. Love in places that we surely do not want to go. That is the mandate. Stop looking up and look around, y'all. Where is God? At our feet, calling us on, fighting for us, and asking us to fight for the world with a servant's towel and a heart of love. Thanks be to God.